Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 74 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the garden room of a country estate by a large fjord in the west of Norway. Outside, the gloomy landscape is veiled by steady rain. The estate belongs to Mrs. Helene Alving, widow of Captain Alving and mother of son Oswald, who has just returned home from Paris, where he was living the bohemian life of an artist. Oswald has ostensibly come home in time to celebrate the ceremonial opening of an orphanage on the estate, built by Mrs. Alving to honor her late husband's name. But in fact, both Mrs. Alving and Oswald are harboring secrets about the real reasons for their coming together to remember Captain Alving. Secrets that will erupt to haunt this family and destroy the captain's legacy. This is Henrik Ibsen's dark family drama, Ghosts, which more than 140 years after it was first published, still retains the power to shock. Its portrayal of illegitimacy, venereal disease, and incest caused outrage in 1881, with critics describing it as unutterably offensive, an open drain, a loathsome sore unbandaged, a putrid play. Booksellers returned copies unopened, and no European theatre would produce it. The play did not receive its English language premiere until 10 years later, that evading the censor only by being presented in a single private performance. The play's unflinching portrait of repressed truths and social hypocrisy has proven enduring because the personal conflicts it exposes are universal. As we record this episode, a new adaptation of Ghosts, written and directed by Joe Hill-Gibbons, is playing at the Globe Theatre in London. In the flickering candlelight that is the only illumination in the indoor space of the Sam Wanamaker Theatre, the ghosts of the play seem to shimmer in the semi-darkness. To discuss this wonderfully powerful play, I am joined today by Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, who is Professor of English and Theatre Studies at St. Catherine's College, Oxford University. Kirsten's research interests include the relationship between modernism and theatrical performance, and more specifically, for our purposes, the writings of Henrik Ibsen. Her first published book was Ibsen and Early Modernist Theatre, 1890 to 1900, published back in 1997. Since when, her other publications include the Cambridge Companion to Theatre and Science, Modern Drama, A Very Short Introduction, and Theatre and Evolution from Ibsen to Beckett, as well as numerous contributions to journals and critical collections. She has been a guest on Melvin Bragg's In Our Time on Radio 4 on the episode devoted to Ibsen, and has acted as a consultant on productions at a number of theaters, including most recently with her article Challenging the Brand, that appears in the program for the current production of Ghosts at the Globe. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Kirsten. Many thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Douglas.
My first question is a personal one. When and where did you first encounter the plays of Ibsen that inspired you to want to study and write about his work? And do you remember when you first came across Ghosts as well?
Oh, that's a great question. So I started to get interested in Ibsen when I studied in Norway at the University of Oslo for a year. I had a Fulbright grant to spend a year in Norway studying Nordic languages and literatures. And that was when I was really introduced to Ibsen in some depth, having only had a few of his plays when I studied drama previously as an undergraduate. So it was really immersive to be in Oslo, to be in the place so expert on Ibsen when you think the Ibsen Center is there.
Yes, fabulous.
Yeah, so it is the place.
I'm sure you visited his apartment, did you? It was a museum, at least a few years ago when I last went. Fantastically evocative, isn't it, to see the place where he lived?
It is.
And you could imagine some of the plays even set in those rooms.
It's unbelievable, isn't it, that you can just go there. And in fact, when I was in Oslo that year, that was the first year of the Ibsen Festival. And I saw some incredible productions. There was an English language, Peer Gynt, that was directed by John Barton. And it was unforgettable. And there was a moment when, because it was quite an intimate space, we were so close. And I love this moment in my memory of when Pierre starts to peel the onion to look at all the layers of himself. And it's, deeply metaphorical. And he peels this onion, and there was a real onion. And the actor was peeling it, and we all could smell and almost tear up because of, smell this onion. It was wonderful.
That's live theater for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what an inspiring introduction. And what about Ghost? Do you remember when you first saw that or read it?
Yeah, so that, of course, was absolutely central to studying Ibsen when I was there. But I didn't see a production until 1994, I think it was, when I saw, and I think it was at Stratford, and it was with Jane Lapotaire.
Oh, yeah.
I could be misremembering, but it was a really powerful performance. You could hear a pin drop in the theater. It was one of those moments when everyone was completely transfixed, and it almost felt like it could have been the original production. It was magical.
Ah, fabulous. I first came across it at the Stratford Festival in Canada, in fact, way back when I was at university in Toronto studying modern drama, and recall it being similarly mesmerizingly powerful and uncomfortable to watch, actually.
Yes.
And I also very much enjoyed the 2013 production at the Almeida with Leslie Manville and Jack Loudon, directed by Richard Eyre. And I remember the sense of claustrophobia in the house being so palpable, Oswald trapped by his illness and smothered by his mother.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about where Ghost comes in the chronology of Ibsen's life and career? And what of his personal experiences in life do you think find their way into the play?
Yeah. Ibsen's career, if you think about his career span, we're talking about roughly 1850 to 1900 from the first to the last plays. And Ghost comes almost smack in the middle. You can forget how important that is because it's often seen as, along with The Doll's House and Pillars of Society, inaugurating this great phase of the social problem plays. But it is very much also a play that he was able to write partly because by that time he was a kind of senior dramatist in Scandinavia. He was one of the established playwrights. So that's important because he's not some young thing kind of throwing down a gauntlet. He's very aware of his status and using that status to do something really radical. And as he himself said in a letter, that he could do as an older playwright that younger playwrights might not have got away with. So he used his platform to do this daring thing. And in answer to the second part of your question about his personal circumstances, well, there are some things that might come into play here. So he, at the age of, I think, 18, he fathered an illegitimate child with a serving maid in the place where he was staying in south coast of Norway. And he has this child at the age of 18 with a woman who's almost 30. And then he proceeds to have to essentially support this woman and the child, but at the same time doesn't have much to do with them. I mean, it's just financial obligation. So he distances himself from that episode in his life.
This must have been an event that one assumes that he would also not really acknowledge very publicly.
Exactly. Exactly what I was going to say, that he's very much marked by that. And the issue of illegitimacy, the fallen woman is right there in his works. He revisits that motif over and over. The idea of illicit love, I mean, you get that with Pastor Manders and Mrs. Alving. There's that whole sense of repressed passion that you see very often in Ibsen's plays and how that derails people. There's also the sense he himself had of the South, especially Italy, Mediterranean sites of great joy and light and inspiration, compared to the, as you see in Ghosts, as you read in the introduction, the sense of darkness and rain.
Yes, perpetual rain. Yeah, so that, of course, because he left Norway, didn't he?
Yeah.
In the mid-1860s, I think, and moved to Italy and then spent some years there living in Sorrento, where I think this play was written. And in fact, I think you said that in looking at his career as a writer, and as you said, that second phase, as you might call it, of his social problem plays, that the sequence of these plays can be thought of in pairs, that Ibsen followed one play with another that carried on addressing questions and themes raised in the previous play. And in this interpretation, I believe you suggest that Ghost can be paired with A Doll's House, which was published 2 years earlier. We talked about A Doll's House in the very first episode of the podcast, in fact. So I'm really intrigued to hear, is this right? Do you think they're connected in some way?
Yes, I do think there's a lot in that, but it's a little complicated. Yes, in a sense, Ghost is a response to people who criticized the idea of a woman leaving her family at the end of A Doll's House. But he had already begun working on An Enemy of the People, the ideas for that play, immediately after A Doll's House. But then he put them aside when Alexander Kielland's novel, which was called Arbeiterfolk, and it's about syphilis, it was called The Syphilitic Novel. When that came out in the spring of 1881, he really had the idea for Ghosts. And he said this repeatedly forced itself upon him, this play that became Ghosts. And he just had to write that before he then went on to go back to Enemy of the People. So that's why I think those three kind of go together.
Yes. It's interesting as well, though, that it seems to me that there's some similarities in the content of A Doll's House and Ghosts, despite the fact you're saying that he didn't actually start that straight away as a response necessarily. That both, of course, they have a woman who is center stage, enduring a less than happy marriage, also harboring secrets. Torrey Rem, who edits the Penguin edition of the plays, he said, and others may have done as well, that the portrait of Mrs. Alving in Ghosts could be imagined as the life Nora would have had if she had stayed.
Yes, exactly.
And it presents the confinement of life in an unhappy marriage and keeping up appearances, which it looked like Nora was destined to do. But in fact, of course, she leaves. And interestingly, in Ghosts, which we'll come to in a minute, because we'll have to talk a little bit more about what actually happens in this play, is that Mrs. Alving had a potential relationship with the local pastor, Pastor Manders, and had left her husband after a year of marriage, but was persuaded to return. So she did actually leave, but went back. So even more an echo, I suppose, of Nora, although with a different outcome.
Yeah, we don't know for how long she left. So this is left a bit open in the sense of one of the ways in which it comes across actually in the original, I think, is that it's a sense that she could have gone, just knocked on his door and that was it. And he sent her home again.
Yes.
Or it could have been for a longer time, but it's sort of left a bit open.
Yes. It's interesting you said earlier about the reception that A Doll's House had. And then also you said that he's at this mature stage of his writing life where he felt that he was able to write on the subjects that he wanted to, and he did specifically in response to this novel you mentioned as well. So it's fascinating that the play received an avalanche of criticism, some of which I quoted at the start, of course. And I guess Ibsen must have expected that the subjects would upset some, but do you think he expected that it would provoke such a response?
I think he miscalculated, actually. I think it surprised him because, in fact, the book didn't sell, as you said, lots of booksellers returned copies unopened. I think it was something like 10,000 copies were printed, which was almost unheard of. You know, this is very early days for dramatic publishing in terms of the play as a piece of literature that gets published. And this is one of the key things that Ibsen does, is he completely reconfigures that entire relationship between the book and the performed play.
Yes, because as I read that actually the novel, particularly in Norway, was not well established as a literary genre, and people bought plays to read, or at least bought his plays to read. Is that right?
I think that's the key. They bought his plays to read. And up until this stage, partly because of the lack of copyright protection, the theaters would buy the rights to a play. It wasn't public. It was premiered as both a script and a performance by that theater. And so it's a fantastic event. And of course, that gets lost when you start having that phenomenon of the play as a book. And you start having audiences knowing the play before they come and see it. And that is partly because of Ibsen having rearranged that relationship.
But in this case, the reception was such that actually the books were essentially withdrawn and no European theater would put the play on initially.
Yeah, it's an amazing story because, Ed, you alluded to the English language premiere, which was in London in 1891 for one performance. It's extraordinary to think of this vitriolic response of the press and so many reviews. It seems disproportionate, doesn't it? When you see quotations that William Archer, Ibsen's English translator in London, that he collected in an article called Ghosts and Gibberings. And he put the juiciest quotations from these vitriolic reviews, and it goes on and on. And it's so extreme that you think, well, it must have been, a long run. And it was actually one performance by the independent theater.
Well, it obviously caused such alarm because its content was so unpalatable. We've referred to the notorious reputation of this play, but for listeners who are not familiar with it, I think we should give them a little bit of a flavor of what exactly it consists of. Would you be able to give us a very brief summary of the plot of the play?
I'll try to be brief, but this is one of the big challenges with Ibsen, because when you say plot synopsis, the first thing to say is it's all discussion. There's almost no action. Action takes place off stage, or, this is the key, before the curtain has gone up. And so what you get is essentially the aftermath of a whole bunch of events that have been determining where we are now. So it's retrospective action. That's really important. So when I start telling you about the plot now, most of it is about uncovering the key events that we have not seen and we can't see because they happened so long ago. So the play opens with Mrs. Alving, this middle-aged woman who's probably about 45. She is delighted because her son Oswald has just returned from his studies in Paris. He's an artist. And as you say, he's been living the bohemian lifestyle. She's also just awaiting the arrival of the pastor, who is her lifelong friend, and the person who's helping her erect this orphanage in honor of her deceased husband, Captain Alving's memory. So they're discussing all the kind of logistics of that. But the first thing we see actually is a beautiful young woman called Regina. She's working for Mrs. Alving as a maid, but turns out she is the captain's illegitimate daughter. Mm-hmm. And this is important because when we see Oswald, we see the captain's son there. And of course, you can see this coming. Oswald is incredibly attracted to Regina. And at the central moment in the play, Mrs. Alving witnesses Oswald trying to kiss Regina. And they do not know at that point that they're related. And so the audience is horrified, just like Mrs. Alving is. And the pastor, of course, knows the background too. But the audience can be confused a little because you also have another character called Engstrand, who is called the father of Regina. So you see them as father-daughter first. And then you find out that's not her real father. And that, in fact, he's been essentially paid off a long time ago to essentially be a stepfather to Regina and give her and her mother respectability, her mother being a serving maid, the one that Captain Alving seduced all those years ago.
Yes, when she was pregnant, wasn't it? They actually arranged for her to leave their employ.
Exactly.
To cover it up, of course. And she marries Engstrand.
Yes. So Engstrand is also lame. And one of the key things that happens in the play is, despite the disability and his having been disadvantaged within this family scheme, he is the one who rises to the top by the end of the play. So while everyone else is sort of going under, he emerges as a survivor. But what happens in the plot for Oswald is that he reveals to his mother that he actually has syphilis. There are sort of three big dramatic strands, if you will, in the play. And one is the revelation that he has syphilis. And then the other is that the pastor and Mrs. Alving are discussing the orphanage, and she's persuaded by the pastor not to take out insurance, because if you do that, it's an insult to God, the pastor argues, because you're saying we don't really trust that God's going to protect this building. Mm-hmm. And you can see this one coming too. There's an accident. We think it's an accident. It could be on purpose, but the orphanage burns. And Mrs. Alving basically just says, okay, so be it. That's it. I'm not having anything more to do with. She just is resigned. And in this play, it's really about her development as a person, as a woman. She says it many times, I want to speak. I want to be heard. I have something to say. It's about her gaining this self-awareness, but also being able to articulate her position. And so while you might think it's all about loss, and it's about she's losing her son, she's losing all her money, the orphanage is burning, it's still about a way in which there's something bigger at stake for her. There's something very much about growth. And this is very modern, to be thinking in terms of self-realization and all of these things that we very much talk about now.
Yes, her journey is, as you say, central to the play and its themes. Just on plot terms, you mentioned one of the threads being that Oswald reveals to his mother that he has syphilis. the diagnosis he had from the doctor in Paris suggests that he inherited this disease from his father, which his mother actually believes as well, because, of course, there's proof already that his father was somewhat dissolute in behavior. But the reality is he may well have contracted the disease through his own behavior. The disease is so advanced that he's actually dying from it and has come home because he's unable to function anymore. You mentioned about how we discover all of these things that happen off stage and that have happened previously in their lives. And what was called, I think, his retrospective technique, wasn't it? Where he gradually reveals the details of previous lives. And of course, that's exactly what the play is about, isn't it, Kirsten? Because it's actually about how the past reappears in the present, in a sense. And that's the very process that goes on as we watch the play. And in fact, it's connected, isn't it, to the title of the play? I was going to ask you what you thought the significance or resonances of the title are.
Yeah, ghosts, it's really metaphorical. When she sees Oswald and Regina sort of kissing, she says it's the past coming back. You know, this is exactly the same thing that happened with her husband and the maid who became Regina's mother. So it's about how the past, it all happens again. But most importantly for her, it's the idea of us being too prone to rehearse old ideas as a society, as individuals. It's about trying to move away from simply living in the same way all the time with the same outmoded ideas. And this is the radical bit. It's actually the metaphorical use of the motif of the genganga, which is the again walkers, which is not exactly a catchy term. So ghosts is the term we use as the translation, but literally it's about those who walk again. And so it's that sense in which it's the old ideas. And that's her central long speech in the play when she talks about, we just can't seem to shed our old ways of being. And in a way, that is the kind of key to the play. The play, after all, if you're hunting for a reason why it should be censored, you'd be hard put to find anything that's actually scandalous in terms of the action. But it's the ideas they're discussing that are shocking. And just to say, this is what Shaw very much picked up on, George Bernard Shaw, and loved about Ibsen and tried to promote that way of writing more honestly, saying, you know, serious drama should treat serious themes. Yet you have lots of boulevard dramas from Paris coming onto the English stage that are incredibly risque, far more risque than something by Ibsen. But because it's in the mode of a serious drama, there's a kind of disproportionate, hypocritical rejection of what is, after all, important, serious stuff that we should be discussing as a society, as Shaw says.
Well, it's more real, clearly. And also I think it's about the suppression of these realities that, of course, Mrs. Alving has kept secret the origins of Regine and the character of Oswald's father from him. And in fact, she sent him letters when he's away extolling his virtues as opposed to the other way around, and keeping his reputation intact in the local community and social terms. All of this has been covered up, the realities of the behavior. And as we talk about the ghosts again, and what it's suggesting metaphorically is that the sins of the father or the mother are visited upon the children in some form. And of course, Ibsen uses the literal metaphor of the syphilis being passed on, which medically may not even be accurate, but in fact actually works better if it isn't. It's more metaphorical, as you say, because it's the impact or effect that we all have on the next generation by our behavior or in our character that is passed on. And of course, if you try and deny these things, they will out.
Yeah.
Which is what happens in the course of the play.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose one of the radical things is that one of the most stringent criticisms the play levies is at religion. Mm-hmm. I mean, the pastor is the most culpable of all the characters in the hypocrisy with which he lives. And of course, that's part of the shock here. And we could lose sight of that because we're a more secular society now. But just to say one thing about the sins of the father idea, I mean, you're absolutely right. I would say Ibsen has a pretty cavalier attitude to the medical accuracy, the science of sexually transmitted disease. But somehow he gets away with it. It works because it's metaphorical. The whole thing doesn't hinge on it being medically correct. But it is true that he could not have got syphilis just because his father lived the way he did. You can get syphilis through the mother.
Yes, which I think is deeply ironic.
Yeah.
Because in fact, you could argue that thematically as well, it is the sins of the mother that are passed down because of her dissembling all of their life about the truth of their family and to him in particular. And her concealing these truths and sending him away, which she does. She sends him away when he's 7 years old because, in her terms, she does not want him to be contaminated by his father.
Yeah.
So in some ways, she has that to answer for. And of course, that is what she's exploring as we go through the play. As you say, it's the center of the play is a journey that she goes on as a process of self-evaluation in relation to her choices in staying with her husband, in covering up his true character, in sending her son away. And she's attempting to understand the reasons and consequences for her living this life she's led and trying also to discover if there is an alternative way now to live, whether actually, for example, telling her son some of the truth would be a better way to go. Because all the way along, she's given in to the dictates of duty and social opinions, particularly as counseled by the pastor. And she goes through this process of self-examination.
She does. And in fact, right at the start of the play, the pastor, there's an important moment at the start where he picks up some books that are lying on her coffee table and he really disapproves of them. And we don't know what they are. He doesn't say. But an audience at that time would probably imagine some of the more scandalous French novels. Let's say Flaubert, Madame Bovary would be one. You might have any forward-thinking literature like On the Origin of Species by Darwin. You might have Nietzsche. In a way, he's saying, you guys supply the titles.
Yes. Does she say, there's a line that says that the books deal with the intellectual trends in the great world outside or something along those lines?
Yeah.
It's fascinating that you raised that because in that respect, the play is in some ways a battle of ideas between her and Pastor Manders, starting with her simply trying to discover more about other ways of life in the world.
Yeah.
And a more progressive way to live. And he, of course, as you said, is an embodiment of the conventional morality of the church. And the debate is initially set out as between her potential open-mindedness and his closed-mindedness.
Yes, it is.
She feels culturally cut off, not surprisingly, living in the backwater in the country as she does. But she is interested in educating herself and seeking examples from the world outside that could help her formulate her own views and identity. But he tells her that such personal exploration is unnecessary.
Yeah.
That the dictates of society, including the church, of course, very specifically, has it all worked out for us, he would say. He actually says you must rely on others, not your own opinions, because if you follow your own opinions, that way anarchy lies.
Yes.
For society, he would say. And he does all this without even having read any of the books that she has on the table, of course, in true blinkered fashion.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, that's such a great point, isn't it, that he hasn't read them. And that's the pattern in the response to Ibsen as well. I mean, some of Ibsen's critics hadn't actually read his stuff. They simply, there was sometimes an alarmist attitude as if people already knew and simply rejected something they hadn't actually read.
Going back to her journey through the play, Kirsten, as we've said, she has been so constrained, oppressed by her maintaining the social appearance, protecting the reputation of the family, that in some ways, I guess, she begins to think she hasn't dared to live herself.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, one of the motifs of Ibsen's plays from about this time is that they feature women finding themselves. I mean, he fastens on the woman problem in all of its ramifications, whether that's the hypocrisy of a double standard where men can sow their wild oats, but women have to be virtuous, and the whole idea that women have no rights. You ceded your property when you got married. Your husband owned what you had brought to the marriage until legislation changed that. So there are all kinds of ways in which he's fascinated by women as the kind of beacon of the future, the testing ground of where we are as a society. And that's really modern too. So that's another issue but why do we still keep coming back to these plays? And it's partly because we haven't actually solved some of the issues or problems that he raises, right?
Yes. Ibsen actually did believe, I think, that his writing could play a part in prompting or provoking social change. And of course, she embodies it in this single character, as he did in Nora, I suppose, in The Doll's House in a similar way. But she she's had years of this life where she hasn't been truthful
Yeah.
to the outside world or herself, and only begins now to start to understand the impact of these choices that she's made on her and others, her son as well in particular. So I wanted to ask you about her relationship with her son, because it's a complicated one, isn't it? She is so keen to see him, but she spent actually, in fact, very little of her life with him. As I said, she sent him away when he was 7, and yet she has so much invested in him because she sacrificed so much for him, in theory.
Yeah, it's true. And then she's colluded in some ways.
Yes.
So it comes back to bite her, right? The fact that she did send him away for his own protection from this bad influence of the father, but at the same time, not being honest about what his father's character really was. And so for all those years, she's set something up that isn't true. And so there's this massive repositioning of the truth, but also raising perhaps that idea that the truth is very much about one's own experience. So I think that's very modern as well, the sense in which his experience needs to be recognized by her. She has to learn how to recognize and listen to what he's saying to her as this grown-up son, this person who is now newly in her life again.
Yes, that's absolutely true, because as we said, she hasn't known him as an adult, really. And she idealizes and in some ways, I suppose, infantilizes him as well, as she would, because she doesn't know him. And his experience is also part of her education in a way, isn't it? Because he has lived a different life in Paris, and she gets a glimpse of that, which she starts to understand that there is an alternative. And interestingly, he argues quite persuasively and articulately about an alternative view of social behaviors. Of marriage, for example. He's lived in a bohemian society where they don't actually have to get legally married, he says, to create a loving home, which would seem pretty outlandish perhaps at the time and to her. But it's actually quite persuasive, of course, because if you look at the alternatives of those who are pretending to create the ideal home in a marriage, which is far from ideal, the evidence would suggest that he's got a point.
Yes, it's true. And actually, she's learning from him. For example, when he tells her how they live, he's telling the pastor, but she's also hearing it. And he's pointedly saying there are different kinds of arrangements in terms of family. It doesn't have to be the nuclear family. That's very modern as well. Having said that, I'm sorry to digress a little bit here, but it's important to note that already Ibsen did something new, not just with the subject matter of this play, but with its form. So one of the key things is the dialogue. First of all, the fact that they speak in short sentences, sometimes just a line. If you look at a page of the dialogue, there's nothing longer than like 2 sentences sometimes for pages and pages. And then the longest bit of the play is not even a full monologue by the standards of what monologues at the time were. And that's fascinating because he's perhaps not given enough credit for how radical that was at the time, to change radically the way in which people spoke on stage. And he gave stage dialogue this everydayness as well. There's nobody sort of declaiming and pronouncing. This is all people sometimes speaking in incomplete sentences and unfinished ideas and very plain speaking, and hardly any asides either. So that's a new thing, rather than helping the audience on by giving them a bit of information in an aside. That's very outmoded by this time. So yes, there's some vestiges of things like melodrama in the whole thing of, oh, the orphanage is burning, just when they've decided not to insure it. But at the same time, you can easily overlook, I think, how radical it was at the time to write the way he did.
Yes, that seems normal to us now, doesn't it? But it obviously is an important step in the history of theater in terms of this new realism, if you want to use that word, and why it seems so threatening to audiences and critics.
Yeah, and it's people watching the way they would speak. And I think that's the key thing that was also the shock factor here, is that it's like looking in the mirror.
Yeah.
So you're watching people say stuff like you would say stuff. And the other thing I just wanted to say while I remember it about Nora and Mrs. Alving, the idea you had mentioned earlier that Mrs. Alving, is sort of an older version, if you will. Well, in a way, if you think about Nora in A Doll's House, we see her learn in almost a heartbeat. I mean, she learns over the course of the play, but she actually says, I'm going to take off my masquerade costume. It's very symbolic. She's saying, I am transforming in front of your eyes because I've now had this realization. Whereas Mrs. Alving, we see an older, as in middle-aged woman who has had time to reflect. on how she has functioned within a dysfunctional marriage and on how she's performed as a mother, what it means to be a woman. And we see that she is reading to learn. She's picking up all kinds of ideas, as you said, from the outside. And in a way, it's almost a continuation of Nora's journey, because Nora goes and slams the door and we don't know what she does. Does she go off and, educate herself?
Well, that's the point. Nora does actually say that she needs to go to educate herself.
Yes.
And it's only the beginning of that process. And you're right that actually, of course, Mrs. Alving has lived much more. And there's much more to assimilate and sift through and to reconcile for her. But I kind of return to the relationship with Oswald in his character and view of his mother even. He refers, when he first comes home, ironically perhaps, to himself as the prodigal son.
Yeah.
That's loaded with meaning, isn't it?
It definitely is, yeah. And it's also a bit calculated, perhaps, in invoking something biblical for an audience that, of course, would have grown up with that knowledge of the Bible. There's a reference there that has a particular resonance for its audience at the time. And then he turns it on its head. And in fact, he's sort of repurposing some of the biblical underpinnings, like the whole idea of the sins of the father, revisiting the children. And he sort of repurposes these things and shocks through that repurposing.
Yes, but psychologically, it's loaded in the sense that I think he recognizes that he isn't really the prodigal son.
Yeah.
Because he knows that he's ill and that he's not what she thinks he is because she barely knows him. So it's ironic, I guess, in that sense, isn't it? That she has this idealistic view of him. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because he somehow feels distant from her, doesn't he?
Yes, it's an interesting relationship, I agree, because he needs her. And we are going to find out, to our horror, the way in which he needs her, which is to administer that medicine, which we didn't really get to in the plot synopsis.
No, we'll come to the end, Kirsten. We're holding back with that.
Okay.
We will get to that final event. But you're right, he does need her. So he's sort of still a child, but not. It's a classic portrait of a man of that age, in a way, a youth of that age who's been away from home, experienced something else of the world. And he must be so frustrated. He confesses it, depressed at coming back to this remote location. He says time and again that there's no way he could live here. There's nothing to do. You can feel his frustration, exacerbated, as I think we've all done, when we're smothered by our parents when we go home.
Yes, and she's miscalculated because she hasn't seen it coming about Regina.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, we're in an isolated place by a fjord, nothing to do, and there's a beautiful young woman and there's this young man her age. Surely she could have seen that coming, but...
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, let's talk about her and her stepfather. So she is not the innocent romantic girl that we see initially. I mean, she's innocent and these things happen to her. It's not her fault.
Yeah.
But her response to it is interesting.
Yes, I think it is important that she isn't calculating and knowing to the extent that she becomes, as in she also goes on a journey.
Ah, of course.
I mean, she has sort of calculated in a way by being so interested in learning French. And of course, that's partly because she also, here again, this is very subtle, but she knows Oswald's coming back.
I'm glad you made this point. This is one of those beautiful things that Ibsen has done with the masterful construction of the play, is that she comes out with these French phrases through the first couple of acts. And you're thinking it's sort of humorously pretentious, right? But then you discover that on a previous visit, Oswald had rather casually suggested to her that she should come to Paris with him at some point. And she has taken this to heart to the extent that she's been trying to learn French for that possibility. And that gives it a whole nother depth and, of course, brings it into the center of the plot as well when they come together.
Yes, but at the same time, at the beginning of the play, we find out from several characters, especially Pastor Manders, that Regina is suddenly quite developed, filled out and womanly. And so it's possible that in retrospect, when she last saw Oswald, she might not have had that physical development. It might have been more innocent.
No, I agree with you. And I think that takes Oswald by surprise as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And he realizes, oh yeah, that was then. But now this means something completely different. But I understand what you're saying about her not being calculating necessarily. But in some ways, she is aware of her own attractiveness, for example.
Yes.
The first scene we see her meeting Pastor Manders and flirting with him in a way that seems pretty bold. And then, of course, ultimately, she's left knowing that she will have to make her own way however she can.
I see it a little bit differently because the self-awareness of her own attractiveness, Ibsen shows us it's created by the men.
Ah, okay.
And you see in this little nutshell of the problem of society and its treatment of women as objects generally. So she becomes self-aware of her charms because she's told over and over, oh gosh, you've really filled out, and oh my goodness, and Pastor Manders is practically slavering. And so that's incredibly transgressive in Ibsen's, what he's doing there.
I guess then goes back to your point that she grows up awful fast because she gets to a point where, because of the twist of the plot, she and Oswald cannot be allowed to be together. So Mrs. Alving tells them the truth, and she is forced to leave. And as she goes, she says a poor girl has to take advantage of her youth. Otherwise, she might end up with nothing before she knows it.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing, is that she's economically disadvantaged compared to this wealthy family she's in. And there's something, I think, I don't want to say guileless, but there's something at the start that's more innocent about her kind of just imagining that it could be her and Oswald, and she's preparing for that. And she's an opportunist, but not in a sort of evil way. Whereas by the end of the play, the scales have fallen from her eyes. She's seen how the world really works. And the very people who should have her interests at heart will abandon her. And she has to make it by herself. And that's why this shocking thing happens at the end of the play. Her stepfather, of course, has been right from the beginning saying, I'm going to set up a home for sailors in the town. And he has this idea that she'll come and be a hostess. And it's never spelled out that she will be a prostitute there. And she rejects that in the beginning. But by the end of the play, she realizes that is her opportunity to have any kind of money, independence. And it's really a sense of the limited options for women that he beautifully illustrates there. A woman with no economic means, what are her options? And here, she's pretty realistic. She has the beauty and the charms, and she can go and operate in this so-called sailor's home.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak realism now, though, isn't it? As you say.
Yeah.
And you mentioned her stepfather. He's a pretty unprincipled character. And interestingly, his very lack of principle seems to be why he succeeds in this world. He, as you said at the top, comes out on top. He ducks and dives, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Whatever lies he comes up with, he seems to be able to slip away from any trouble. And, he fools the pastor into supporting, in fact, he blackmails him into supporting his plan to open this so-called hostel for sailors, which, as you say, will be not much more than a brothel.
Exactly.
And yet he does manage to survive.
Absolutely.
It's a condemnation of I suppose, in Ibsen's terms, of the society that enables that kind of character to prosper.
Yes, and here's Shaw a few years later with Pygmalion, picks right up on this character of Engstrand, and he gives Alfred Doolittle, who, of course, is totally charming, and he does succeed almost in spite of himself through his being able to go with whatever opportunities arise. Despite dissipation and, loose living, he also comes out on top. He becomes wealthy.
Yeah, I think he's a much more charming character than Engstrand.
Yeah, you think so. I mean, it's an interesting position within a play of being a sort of minor character. This is a play of 5 characters, and it's actually quite even in a way in terms of the amount that each character speaks. I mean, Engstrand actually says a lot. He's not a minor character.
Yes, he's another representative with Manders of the hypocrisy of the current society, I think, in Ibsen's mind, because everything he says is not genuine. And yet, as we're saying, he seems to prosper. As time wears on, I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about the central theme of the truth. I said earlier that Ibsen was determined that his writing might be able to change prevailing values in conventional middle-class society, many of which he believed were hypocritical and certainly restrictive. And of course, as you said, he was particularly interested in how these existing attitudes prejudiced the lives of women. And he focused his challenge to social restriction in terms of championing truth as the essential prerequisite for individual freedom. It's about individual freedom being set against the hypocrisies or restrictions of social morality of the times. And then he would like to see change in that, and that is by recognizing truth rather than upholding hypocrisies that he sees in institutionalized morality.
I suppose I would probably say, well, what do you mean by truth?
Well, it is a good question because it's about truth personally, is it? I mean, she's disguised the truth of her life to the outside world, but also to herself. So she's not been honest to herself or to her son. And I've read in various places that Ibsen associated truth with freedom to create a more truthful society if he sees that the institutions are not truthful because they're not recognizing natural instincts and behaviors.
Yeah, well, this is exactly the central problem, if you will, for Ibsen is how do you reconcile institutions that are artificially constructed like marriage, religion, things that are enshrining certain ways of being and promoting them that are not compatible with the so-called, natural order and the way in which we might live if we might have polygamous relationships. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities that get shut down because we're sort of rooted into this very narrow way of being, is what he seems to be saying. And there's a kind of central inner truth that we might say is our self, uninhibited, unrestricted, but then it's always being constrained by the social pressures to conform to a certain way of living. And that means subscribing to these institutions. I think I'm just trying to say where Ibsen might be coming from as an artist and what he's trying to do with his plays. He's not trying to be prescriptive. He's trying to identify this problem and then say, okay, there's no resolution in this play. You have to figure out the next step. And that was the other radical thing, is he kind of shifted. You mentioned retrospective action, but also the shift away from climax followed by denouement, resolution. He has a climax and then he has a discussion and then no resolution.
That's beautifully put, the conflict between natural feeling on the one hand and belief in authority on the other, as he put it. And I think that's a quote from his essay, Notes for the Modern Tragedy, which is about the world being governed by laws made by man, which is very pertinent to A Doll's House, and the woman not having an equal opportunity to share in that world.
Yes.
But it applies more generally to the restrictions of social institutions, which inevitably have to exist, or the alternative is anarchy. The chaos of our individual behaviors or instincts, have to have some limit, one would argue, so that those things are hugely difficult to reconcile, which I think brings us perhaps quite neatly to the ending, where you talked about the lack of resolution. And spoiler alert here, everyone, the end of the play, we've already said that the orphanage burns down, but the very end of the play, we find Oswald, who has told his mother about his disease and the seriousness of it. And in fact, he is suffering to a degree that he asks her to end his suffering by administering a lethal dose of morphine. I think he had hoped, am I right in thinking this, that Regina would be the one who would do that. And in fact, one of the reasons that he was attracted to her was that he believed she would have the strength of character, or at least the detachment, even possibly ultimately, to be able to accede to his request to help him die, which may not have been what she had bargained for. But nonetheless, that's not what happened, because she is essentially banished from the house and he is left with his mother, who has promised that she will do everything for him. And he asks her to honor that promise by administering this dose of morphine so that he will not continue to suffer.
Yes.
Which leaves the question, at the end of the play, we are left with he having a further attack and Mrs. Alving left with this horrible choice, the worst possible choice. And of course, Ibsen leaves us without the answer of what she actually does.
Yes. I have seen productions that decide what happens, and it's really hard to watch.
Really?
Yeah, I've seen a production where Mrs. Alving decides at the last minute to give the pills to Oswald. And so you see her administering them. They take it a step further and actually decide for you. But to me, it's electrifying and horrifying in the same measure that at the end, we don't know. We have to resolve it ourselves as we might do. Would we opt for the euthanasia, or would we stand there paralyzed and not be able to do it? So it's an incredibly important thing to me that the burden is on the audience to decide.
Yeah, that's so true. The power of that is extraordinary to absorb, to witness, to actually stand in with. And it resonates really powerfully with the current public discussion in our time about the legalities of euthanasia for the terminally ill.
Yes.
And it dramatizes that very thing, how difficult, traumatic, and painful this situation would be, the worst possible, to act to kill someone you love, to end their suffering.
Yes.
And also, I think the lack of resolution is interesting because it is irreconcilable in some respects, always, as have many of the things in the play been in her journey too. For example, she seems paralyzed in some way between trying to maintain this sunny outlook of the mother-son relationship where she can make everything all better for her sick child and that he will be well again some future. She keeps trying to say this, but we also see that she understands the horrible reality of his condition as well, and also understands that it's connected to her recognizing truth, which she's been suppressing her whole life, and that this is almost habitual. How does she deal with truth?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's also not forget that it's another situation which puts the woman at the center. She has an incredibly hard decision to make. And this is where I always come back to Ibsen's own insistence that his interest is in the position of women. It's not, it's all about the universal. It's all about people generally. Ibsen's plays are about people's self-realization, etc. No, it's actually, you can find it in his own writing, in his letters, and over again in his plays, that he specifically is choosing women to explore these kinds of fundamental problems. So the fact of an uneven playing field, if you will, in terms of gender roles at the time is what really galvanizes him in a lot of these situations. So here we have Mrs. Alving, a mother, a woman, having to make this impossible decision. Does she have the toughness? Does she have the strength? Or would it be a weakness, in fact, to accede to his demands? So it's left to us to figure that out. And by extrapolation, how we feel about women and mothers generally, perhaps.
You're spot on. You've actually answered what was going to be my last question, and which you started with, I think, about the enduring relevance and power of this play, because the questions it raises about women's position remain certainly not resolved. It's extraordinary, the perceptiveness of Ibsen in addressing these questions, more than 140 years ago. And it's the same with Doll's House, isn't it? Which still continues to shock us because it feels so relevant.
Absolutely. And I would just say with The Doll's House, I sometimes will talk with my students about this play and will say, has it lost its power to shock? Because the idea of a woman leaving her 3 children would probably still shock.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting thing about Ibsen having written so long ago, and yet there's a freshness there in terms of what it's presenting us with as a problem or as a challenge.
I would say it's a really well-constructed drama of deep family dynamics and moral dilemmas, and we witness the inflexibility of moral codes and the hypocrisies in people's behavior. These things never go away in whatever society we're forging.
Absolutely, yes.
And in individuals' human behavior.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Kirsten. What a wonderful play to get our teeth into. Before I let you go, however, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do on the podcast, or that's just a personal favorite. Is there one that you might volunteer for our listeners that you particularly love?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I have particular interest in theater and science and how theater and science relate to each other, how playwrights incorporate scientific ideas into their plays, and especially how they're enacted. And I've been thinking that I'd love to see more discussion of this play I absolutely love by Margaret Edson called Wit. It's about an English professor who is diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. And it's about her relationship to the doctors who are treating her. It's very much a medical drama, but it's also very much about her love of John Donne's poetry, which she teaches.
Oh, wow.
And that journey that she takes as we see her get more deeply involved in the treatment and sort of reconciled to the situation she's in, which is terminal cancer. But it's an absolutely beautiful play, and it's incredibly moving, but it's also funny, and it's absolutely an amazing piece of work.
That sounds fascinating. Sounds like it might be tough to watch as well.
There's a brilliant production, an HBO movie that features Emma Thompson. It's wonderful, but I would say try to read it first. It's always great to read the play first, in my book.
Okay. Well, that goes back to Ibsen and reading plays and seeing
That's
plays.
right. Yes.
We certainly love to read plays on the podcast, so we'll seek that one out. Thank you very much, Kirsten, and thank you so much for joining me today.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
As the curtain falls on Mrs. Alving cradling her suffering son, she is faced with the hardest choice of all: to maintain the delusion that all will be well, or to assist him to die, and in so doing, accept the truth, perhaps, about the damage that her life of lies has wrought, the broken family, the missed joys. The ghosts that haunt us are the mistakes that we make when we fail to act truthfully. With this final sacrifice, perhaps Mrs. Alving will find the freedom she has been denied or denied herself. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Joe Hill-Gibbons' new adaptation of Ghosts continues at the Sam Wanamaker Theatre at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London until the 28th of January, 2024. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.